Hey again, this is Joe. It's nice to greet you again virtually for the second of two online lectures about some of the terms we're going to use in this Intro to Literature class. This lecture focuses on fiction and a lecture that in my face-to-face classes I normally call the knobs on the fiction stereo. So let's get started. So if you've got a really high-end stereo, like a $3,000 stereo, your stereo is going to have a lot of knobs on it. And I don't have a stereo like that. Actually, most of the music I listen to is just on my ordinary car stereo or on a computer. And for a music player like that, you really might only have a few knobs. Volume and balance and treble and bass. And for an introduction to lit class, while there are lots and lots of terms that we could throw around and start using to start classifying fiction, I think it's probably best in this short unit to just stick with a few basic terms. And so once again, I've limited this list to 5 terms. There are actually some really important terms that aren't on the list, but these are 5 terms that I know we can use to talk about the stories that we're going to be looking at for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Plot, character, point of view, tone, and symbol. You might notice that one of the biggest terms, setting, and also style, another big term, that those aren't on the list. And that doesn't mean that you can't talk about stories in terms of setting or style, but I think for this class we'll just stick with the most basic definition of setting, which is the time and the place that the story takes place. And there's a lot more we could say about it in a more advanced class, but for now let's just use that as our working definition. These other terms, though, plot, character, point of view, tone, and symbol, I think we can unwrap those a little more and really delve down into them and hopefully use them use them to intelligent effect in our our class forums and also in the writing that you're going to do. You've got the first of the big literary analyses to do for this unit. It's going to be on the picture of Dorian Gray, and I'll be hoping to see some accurate and thoughtful use of these terms: plot, character, point of view, tone, and symbol. So let's get started on those. All right, so plot. There are a few great writers out there who are also great visual artists, like Mervyn Peake and Wyndham Lewis. I am not somebody who is both a writer and a visual artist. I think I'm a pretty good writer, but I am a pretty rudimentary visual artist, as you're going to see with this little drawing. When we talk about plot, your working definition is probably what happens in the story. That's a very simple working definition of plot. But it might be nice to break apart the different parts of a story, the different milestones in the action of a story. And there are lots of ways to visualize that. I drew a really simple line drawing that hopefully will illustrate a few of the terms that I'm going to want us to use. And so you're going to just see a line come across the slide, and if you think about the vertical axis, the line is basically showing how much action, how intense the action is in the story. So if the line is towards the bottom of the screen, that's kind of a low action where not much is happening in the story. And then as the line moves up, that is when the action is rising, when the action becomes more intense. And this is even true in stories where maybe the overall action isn't super intense. Within the context of the story, if the action is intense, we'll think of the line moving up the screen, and then as it moves across the screen, that's as the story moves ahead in time. So we could just start by saying most stories start out with a pretty low amount of action, and the very earliest portion of the story is referred to as the exposition, which is basically just where the author is introducing the characters, kind of introducing the setting, giving the reader just a basic feel of the lay of the land. Who are the people we're going to be wanting to pay attention to, and what's the situation of the story? At some point, usually fairly early on in the story, if the story is good, there's going to be something that complicates the lives of the characters, or at least the life of one of the characters. And as you might imagine, that's called the complication. And you can see that often at that point, the action of the story rises. Things start to get a little more intense. If we take the example of the story Wood, which is an example I'll use a lot this lecture because I know you've all read that story. The exposition basically just tells us about Roy and his wife Leah, and kind of how their relationship is, and how Roy likes working out in his shed and drinking rye by himself, and how he is a furniture upholsterer, and how his real his true love is to go out in the bush and cut wood. And the complication occurs when he's out in the bush cutting wood on this farmer's place, the suitor's place, and he sees the town drunk, Percy, and Percy tells him a story about how some big operation is going to come to that stand of wood, out to that bush, and clear it to sell all that wood to the inn, which is a place that Roy's not crazy about. So that's what kind of complicates life a little bit for Roy. At some point, the action is going to keep rising until it hits a real high pitch. Even in a story where not a lot seems to be happening, like Wood, there's going to be points where there's more action than less. And as that action continues to rise and rise, we call that the crisis. And I would argue that in the story Wood, the crisis occurs basically when Roy breaks his ankle. Okay, he's out in the bush. You can over page after page, you can tell he's getting a little more upset about Percy's story. He's not sure what's up. Why that farmer suitor would make a deal behind his back, and all of that is you can kind of feel the tension rising in Roy, but things don't really don't spin up that hot until he falls and breaks his ankle. And then the story really takes on a different cast, doesn't it? Now we're not sure whether Roy's gonna survive. He's got to crawl out of the forest in the snow and the dark. He's got to leave his tools behind. Now it's a story with a little more at stake, right? Well, that crisis can't last forever. It's usually a relatively short part of the story, and it's gonna at some point come to a climax. The climax is just a Greek word meaning ladder. It's sort of the top of the ladder. That's the point that the story's been driving towards up to this point. And I would argue in Wood, the climax is when Leah shows up kind of out of the blue, unexpected, to rescue Roy. She's been sick. Roy isn't quite sure what's wrong with her. He loves her, but he's kind of disconnected from her. And here she shows up, and it seems like she's got her energy back. And there's something that Roy feels for her that he doesn't, he hasn't been feeling on, such an immediate basis. Obviously, he loves her, but he hasn't felt the kind of connection to her until she kind of shows up out of the blue to basically rescue him. And then, once that climax has been reached, the story does drop off, and the action becomes calmer. The the last questions about the story get answered in this last that last piece of plot, which is referred to as the denouement. And the denouement is just a French word meaning untying. It's where the last of the loose ends are untied. So that's a very basic kind of schematic drawing of plot. And those 5 terms are terms that you'll probably hear me use, and that I'll ask you to use as you look through the next stories in the novel that we look at. Exposition, complication, crisis, climax, and denouement. By the way, these are terms that are really not so different from how we would use them in drama or in TV and movies. The formula might look a little different in a movie, but not so much. There's really an exposition in a movie, and then somewhere, usually around minute number 20, there's some kind of complication that drives towards a crisis and finally a climax, and then you're going to have, the last 5 to 10 minutes of the movie where everything gets kind of wrapped up at the end. So, what more can we say about plot? Well, first off, for this story that you're reading to be effective, for it to have an impact on you, there's going to have to be a conflict of some kind. Some of you, I remember from the forum about Woods, that was a criticism that some of you had, is it felt to you like nothing was happening in the story. And I partly was pulling a fast one on you a little bit, because Alice Munro's stories are generally pretty quiet. And there is conflict in them, but you got to really look for it. It's not necessarily the kind of conflict that will jump out at you in an obvious way, the way it often does with a fantasy story or a science fiction story. I also know from seeing what you all wrote in the forums that a lot of you, when you read science fiction, fantasy, that's for mysteries. Those are genres that many of you are really into. And yeah, you take a fantasy or science fiction franchise like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Star Wars. It's hard not to see the conflict there. The conflict is, in the case of Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, it's sort of a cosmic battle of good and evil. And yeah, you don't see that in Alice Munro. And you may not see that in all of the other stories we read, although I would argue that the stories that we're going to look at next, probably the conflict's a little more obvious than in the Munro story. No matter, if the story is going to be good at all, there's going to be a conflict of some kind there. I would argue that the Alice Munro story is a really good story, but the conflict has to be searched for a little bit. There's a conflict there. It's just not an obvious one. At any rate, what kind of conflicts are we talking about? Well, often, most simplistically, there's going to be one character versus another character. It's going to be the Fellowship of the Ring versus Sauron, or Harry Potter versus Voldemort, or Luke Skywalker versus the Emperor Palpatine or Darth Vader, right? Sometimes it's not quite that bald-faced. Sometimes it's a character versus his or her environment. And I would say that at least some of the conflict, not all of it, but some of the conflict in Wood was a character versus environment conflict. Certainly at the point of the crisis, Roy's real conflict was trying to keep himself alive, trying to get himself out of the wood. When the snow's falling, when night has fallen, and when he's broken his ankle. So, at least a part of the conflict in that story was a character versus environment. But I think one of the biggest places where you're going to find conflict, and where conflict isn't always so obvious, where you have to look for it a little bit, is also the character's conflict with herself or with himself. And I think that's really the conflict at the root of the story Wood, is that Roy's a nice guy, we like him, he's honest, he's good-natured, he doesn't mean anybody any harm, but his real problem is that he is disconnected from other human beings. He knows a lot more about trees than he does even about his own wife. And the real conflict is his needing to come to an understanding about just how disconnected he is, just how alienated he is from the people in his life. All right. Well, you can tell just from all of our just from explaining plot that it's going to be hard to understand plot really without understanding the term character. This is a place where stories really are very different from poems. I've read lots of poems that have a plot where there's a story involved, but one thing that all stories have to have, and that poems don't necessarily have to have, is they got to have characters. Stories are built around characters. And let's just take a moment before we go any further and remember the purpose of art. Remember the purpose of all literature. All art purports to help us understand what it means to be a human being. It's up to us to decide for ourselves what it means to be human. And art is one of the ways that we tell ourselves the story of what it means to be a human being. Now, if we operate from that definition, you'll kind of, I think, see how important characters are. All characters, all characters in literature are at their core human. Sometimes that's obvious, like in the story Wood. Obviously, all of the characters are human. Roy, Leah, Percy, they're all human beings. But you might think, well, wait, what about, what about Curious George? What about the rabbits in Watership Down? What about Klingons? I mean, they're obviously not human. Think again. Think more deeply on what those characters are representing. Curious George is this curious, sweet little chimpanzee. Although, if you know anything about real chimpanzees, you realize that Curious George isn't really very much like a real chimpanzee. Curious George is a lot more like a little boy, or a lot more like a little girl, who happens to look like a chimpanzee. I'm reminded of the great science fiction author Stanislaw Lem and his book Solaris, talking about finding alien races, going out into space and finding alien civilizations. And he's got this great quote about it. He says, "We are only seeking man. We have no need of other worlds. We need mirrors. We don't know what to do with other worlds." That is, when we look out, into the sky to look for alien civilizations, what we're really looking for is a reflection of ourselves. We are looking at our own desires and our own fears. And so Klingons and Romulans and Vulcans, those are representations of what we want to be, or hope to be, or fear ourselves to be. And that's true of all character in literature. Even if the character doesn't seem very human, what we're really exploring are human motivations, because that's the only way. We can't be anything but human, and so we can only relate to characters to the extent that those characters represent human desires and needs and fears. And so even if the character superficially may not look so human, like Master Shake or Frylock or Meatwad, you know, Master Shake and Frylock and Meatwad are, three stoners in New Jersey. They happen to look like, a milkshake and fries, but, they're actually really human beings. All right, what more can we say about character? Well, there are some terms about character that we could use when we're trying to talk about how we see a character, how we view him or her. Here are some ways that you might think about how characters can be different from one another. First off, there's a term from E.M. Forster, the guy who wrote Room with a View, who made a distinction between round characters and flat characters. And round characters are those characters that are fully fleshed out in the story, that have real detail built into their depiction. And maybe not coincidentally, these are characters that change over the course of the story. So you think about that story. Roy is obviously a round character. We know more about Roy than about any other character in the story, and he does change. He does come to some understanding of the disconnection that he's suffered from. Leah, his wife, she also obviously changes. She comes back, at least temporarily, from her depression and her sort of mysterious illness to connect with her husband and to save him. Flat characters, on the other hand, they're often less detailed, they're less fleshed out, and they also fail to change. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily minor characters. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad characters. It's just that the action of the story is not about any changes that those characters are going to make. So Percy, for example, Percy starts the story, as, the lovable town drunk, and he ends the story as the lovable town drunk. He's basically just the same Percy all the way through. These are often background characters. Like I said, they don't have to be, but they often are. All right, so another a pair of terms that I think you're going to want to have in your toolbox when you talk about characters are protagonist and antagonist. And often students will oversimplify these terms and think, well, protagonist means hero and antagonist means villain. That is not necessarily the case, as you're going to see in Picture of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is not a hero. In fact, you could argue he's an anti-hero, but he is the protagonist. The protagonist is the character from whose perspective we're seeing the action. So if we're watching Dorian Gray move through the world, Dorian Gray is the protagonist. If there is a character that is arrayed against him, that's trying to resist him or push him back, that's the antagonist. And the antagonist is not always a villain. Also, maybe it's obvious, but I'll say it, not every story has a human antagonist. Who is the antagonist in the story Wood? There's really no villain in that story. Percy's annoying. Percy causes problems for Roy, but he does it inadvertently. He does it. He doesn't do it with any kind of malice. And the inn that Roy is so opposed to, they really haven't done anything to him either. Roy's only real antagonist is himself, or his disconnection from his fellow human beings. Finally, another binary that we might look at here when we talk about characters: sympathetic and unsympathetic. And basically, this is asking us, how relatable are these characters? So, the reader roots for the sympathetic character. We relate to the sympathetic character, and we are opposed to the aims of unsympathetic characters. We kind of want to see the unsympathetic characters fail. And hopefully that's pretty straightforward. The last thing I'll say about it, though, is also, I hope, kind of obvious, that unsympathetic characters often do become sympathetic over the course of a story, and vice versa. Often characters will start sympathetic, become unsympathetic, and then return to, being characters we can relate to at the end. So that can change, but it's important to be aware as we're reading the story how our feelings about the character are changing. How is the writer manipulating our reaction to the character? All right, let's talk about point of view. This one will go a little faster. So, point of view is basically answering the question, who's telling this story? Well, if the person telling the story is a character in the story, saying, I did this, I did that, here's what I said to that guy, that's a first-person story. And that's a very common way to tell a story. I don't know, I'm trying to think now. There is one story we're reading, the Kafka story, that is told in first person. So it's a relatively less common point of view, but I'm sure you've all seen stories that start with, I did this, I did that. If the person telling the story is a voice outside the story itself, a kind of disembodied narrator, we call that a third person story. You may wonder, well, what happened to second person? There are actually a few stories written in second person, which is where the narrator is saying, you do this, you did that, you go into that bar and talk to that guy. You can probably tell that's not a very common story structure. I'm trying to think. Bret Easton Ellis's book, Bright Lights, Big City, is written in second person. Lori Moore's story, How to Be a Writer, is written in second person. But off the top of my head, those are the only two examples I can think of out of the many stories and books I've read that is in second person. That's a very rare structure. Third person, very, very common. Wood is told in third person. The person narrating is not Roy, it's not Leah. It's a kind of a character outside the story, right? Now, most stories we read are going to be in third person, but there are ways to characterize even those third person stories. Before we get to that, though, let's talk just a little bit more about first-person stories. When you've got a first-person story, the question you've got to ask yourself right out of the box is, how much can I trust this narrator? Is this narrator reliable? Or does this narrator have a view that is limited? Is the narrator not able to see some things that I, the reader, can see? Does the narrator maybe have any motivation to not tell me the truth in order to make him or herself look better? That kind of narrator is called unreliable narrator. Your basic ground assumption when you read a story in first person is that your narrator is reliable. You always start from the perspective that, yeah, I've got a reliable narrator. But if you pay attention as you read, you're often going to find, first person narrators where you realize as the story goes on, I can't trust this guy because he can't see something that I am able to see as the reader. And if that's the case, it's an unreliable narrator. And that is not a failing of the story. That's often a very subtle and effective writing technique. It can really kind of sow doubts in your mind about what the truth of the story really is. Now, for third person stories, the question you want to ask is, first off, how many people's heads are we able to get into? If there's this disembodied voice that's telling the story and the narrator's not a character in the story, you want to ask yourself next, are we able to tell what any of these characters is thinking? Are we able to get into any of these characters' heads? If we can't get into anybody's heads, if all we know is what people say and do, it's called a limited third person, or sometimes it's called dramatic third person story. That's actually relatively rare. I'm trying to think of any stories that we read. I don't believe any of the stories we read is in limited third person. Um, if you have a story where you get into everybody's head, where you know what everyone is thinking in the story, that's omniscient. You probably know that word omniscient meaning all-knowing. That's where the narrator is kind of like the voice of God, because you're able to, as the reader, to see into everybody's motivations. That also is relatively rare. Far more common, and this is going to be the point of view of most of the stories we read, is limited omniscient, where you're able to get into one person's head, or the heads of a limited number of people. You know what one character, or maybe a couple of characters, are thinking and feeling and hoping, but the other characters, you really can only see what they do and what they say. All right, so let's get to tone. Tone tells us what the author's attitude is towards a number of different important parts of the story. It tells you what the author's attitude is towards the material. Is this author taking the material seriously? I mean, obviously, if a author spent weeks or months or years putting this story together, obviously that author does care about the material of the story. But how does she care about it? Does she want to ridicule that material for you? Or does she want to show you how serious it is? Her attitude towards the material is going to really tell you what the tone of the story is. Also, what is this reader's attitude, or what's the writer's attitude towards the reader? What does this writer want you to agree with? And then finally, what's this author's attitude towards the people in the story? All of that is really, they go towards determining the tone of the story, whether this is a serious dark story, or a lighthearted ironic story. One of the actually key elements of the stories we're going to read, in fact it's a key element of all good art, is irony. And irony is actually a pretty hard term to define. If you don't think so, take a minute and try to define it yourself. It's a word we've all heard a lot, and I use it all the time, kind of knowing what I mean when I say it. But it was actually kind of hard for me when I put this lecture together to think, all right, how would I define irony for others? Here's my definition, and you can take it or go with a different one. But I would say that irony is the way that the writer shows us our own limitations. This is how the writer shows us human, sort of human foibles, human limits. Irony occurs when we, the reader, or when a character is hoping for something, just, hoping passionately for something, and he or she gets that and then realizes it wasn't what he or she wanted. That I thought I knew what I wanted, but then I got it and I realized it wasn't what I wanted. That's irony. Or when I'm afraid something's going to happen to me, I'm maybe terrified it's going to happen to me, I'll do anything to keep it from happening. And yet, as the story goes on, readers notice that I'm doing the very things that are going to make this thing happen to me. That's irony, right? Where I'm trying to control my fate, and I'm trying to keep something that I'm terrified of from happening, and yet everything I do is actually making that fate come true. And we see that I mean, it's often kind of sad, but we see it in real life with with people's actions. We also see that a lot in fiction, and so irony is one of the key elements, one of the key tools that a writer's going to use to establish a tone. Is what parts of this story are ironic. Irony always implies at the root of it that there's a little surprise for you, the reader. Something you were expecting was going to happen doesn't happen the way you expected it, and that disconnect, that contradiction of attitudes is what creates the irony. So what are Monroe's attitudes towards the material, towards the reader, towards the characters in the story Wood? um, I don't want to blather on about it. I'll just mention a couple of thoughts about it. She clearly has a basically sympathetic portrayal of Roy and Leah and even Percy. I mean, she doesn't make very. I mean, she maybe makes gentle fun of Percy a little bit, but there's no ridicule. There's no real harsh finger pointing about it. It's a very gentle story, and she portrays it in such a way that I I believe she's hoping for you, the reader, to have that kind of, that kind of fond feeling for these characters as well. It's a very sympathetic portrayal of these characters, and the irony at the root of the story, I think, is that um, Roy, who believes himself so self-sufficient and who believes himself, to be so safe out there in the bush, does exactly what he told himself and told his wife he was, never going to do. He was too safe for that, and he ends up nearly dying, and realizes only at the end of the story that he depends on his wife, his sickly invalid wife, way, way more than he realizes. In fact, in some ways, he depends on her more than she depends on him. And that shift in his expectations is the root of the irony of the story. All right, we're nearly done here. Let's talk about symbol. A symbol, now symbols occur in all art, not just in literature and stories. They occur in poetry and drama and movies. A symbol is basically where one thing stands in for another thing. It's really the way that your story that you're reading points at a deeper idea. This story isn't just about a guy going out into the woods and cutting trees down. There's something beneath that those trees represent. There's something that solitude represents. And there are a couple different kinds of symbols. One of them is the name is maybe a little misleading, what you could call universal symbols. And basically, those are symbols where an entire culture recognizes what this person or place or thing represents just because of our cultural heritage. A very simple example is if you look at in Western society, in societies that come from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, the Abrahamic traditions. When you talk about a snake is a symbol of deceit and deception. A snake is a symbol of lying. I am 100% sure of this, that nobody listening to this lecture has ever been lied to by a snake. And yet, everyone in Anglo-American culture, when we think of a snake, when we think of a snake in the grass or he's a snake, what we mean is that's a deceitful person. And of course, that symbol comes to us from the Bible, from the story of the fall from the Garden of Eden, that the serpent beguiles Eve into tasting the fruit, and that snake, kind of takes on a life of its own later on in later pieces of art, so that we come to associate the snake with deception and lying. There are, if you look at the maybe slightly less known story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, even if you've never read the Tower of Babel story in the Bible, you've seen the tower show up in other places. There's the tarot card of the tower. There's Sauron's Dark Tower, Barad-dûr from Lord of the Rings. And in both cases, these towers are drawing on this old Judeo-Christian image of the Tower of Babel, the sort of the mortal striving to build a tower to heaven and to become godlike, and how you can definitely see on the left how that's doomed to failure. And of course, if you saw the movie. So, last thing to say about symbol is that a lot of symbols are not universal. They are contextual. And that basically means that within the context of this work of art, this item is going to mean this thing. And that's probably more common for the stuff we're going to look at in this class. The tattoo machine in the Kafka story, that doesn't come from the Bible or from ancient history. That's something that came out of Kafka's mind. And yet, as you read the story, you can tell that that tattoo machine represents something. The picture, the physical picture of Dorian Gray, same thing. A picture can mean a bunch of different things in different contexts. Within the context of that novel, what does it mean? So, what do the trees symbolize in wood? Now we're running longer than I want to run, so I'll just take 30 seconds here to invite you to think about what was it in those stories that made Alice Munro put all that detail about the different kinds of trees and how to cut down a tree. I mean, you might notice that Roy has a lot more detail at his disposal about trees than he does about the people in his life, and that might mean that the trees, sort of symbolize his solitude, his alienation. Well, just as with poetry, there's way more to know than I was able to tell you in this, 37-minute video. But these terms, just to review, give us a starting vocabulary. These are the terms that I'm really hoping to see you use as you go through these stories in this novel. Plot, character, point of view, tone, and symbol. Good luck. I'm excited to see your work on the forums. I'm excited to see your paper. Take care.